Welcome. My name's Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I'm pleased you can join us for this program on Speaking of America, a conversation with knowledge experts. We're delighted to have three scholars for this engaging discussion. The Speaking of America docuseries instructor, Mary Kate Cary, is serving as the moderator for this program. She's joined by experts in the UVA McIntire School of Commerce, Robert Patterson, and Katie Gary in the Department of Drama, College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. This docuseries was a labor of love for Mary Kate. Thank you so much for providing this rich resource for our alumni, parents, and friends to learn and enjoy for many years to come, Mary Kate. I will introduce her shortly. Audience, should you have a question during this program, please submit it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This talk is being recorded and will be posted in the Lifetime Learning's podcast library in a week or so. Now allow me to introduce our moderator. Mary Kate Cary is the former Assistant Vice President in the University of Virginia's Office of the President. Previously, she served as lecturer in the Politics Department at UVA. Recently, Mary Kate began a new position at the University of Denver. Ms. Cary is the former White House speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush and served as spokesperson for the U.S. Attorney General William Barr in 1992. She's the executive producer of the award-winning documentary 41 on 41, in which 41 extraordinary people tell their best stories about former President Bush 41. Again, panel, thank you for sharing with us today. Welcome. Mary Kate, the microphone is all yours. Begin your program.
Thank you, Althea. This has been just a joy to be involved with such a fascinating docuseries. I think I learned more than anybody else did. I had a wonderful team of student researchers who helped me with all this. And I can't say thank you enough to them because I think, like I said, I learned more than they did. I've invited a couple of friends here today to join us and talk about this whole docuseries, but specifically the second half. And so let me start by introducing both of them. First, we have Katie Gary, who is the senior lecturer in the Department of Drama at UVA. Her career has been focused on acting, but she has pivoted lately to helping students discover their communication skills. And she's now the faculty advisor for the UVA Speaking Center, which is student facing to get the students to learn how to stand up on their own 2 feet and address the crowd. And I also have Rob Patterson, my friend, who is the associate professor of commerce in the McIntire School. He teaches seminars out of the provost's office on the greatest speeches in American history. He, for a while there, wrote speeches for the governor of Nebraska, amongst others, and he also teaches public speaking, writing, and corporate communications. So if they could join us here, that would be great. I would love to see them, and we will get started here.
Thank you, Mary Kate.
There we go.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So I thought we'd start with just some big thoughts, and then we'll turn to our audience and get their reaction to some of these speeches in the second half of the docuseries. And I think that it was a nice mix of women in America, civil rights, World War II, and the Cold War, the American adventure into space. I don't think most people associate speeches with space travel. And it's been a great progression, I thought. And then we ended with the grand finale, the Gettysburg Address. But anything that jumped out at you before we get into the specifics of the speeches? Katie, any sort of big picture thoughts on some of the speeches that we focused on?
For me, it was so wonderful to watch many of these speeches and hear how often the speakers called out other forms of art, how often poetry was quoted, how often song became very important, especially songs that are songs that Americans know that are close to our hearts. That was really wonderful. And the storytelling, too, the
Hmm.
storytelling. Listening to some of the speeches, it really reminded me of times in my own life that I remembered those speeches specifically and what was happening at that time. Um, and it was quite amazing to go back to them. It also reminded me how important it is to tell stories to each other.
Hmm.
It's a great way to remind us of who we are and to share our experiences.
Rob, any big picture intro thoughts?
Absolutely. For me, a number of these speeches are ones that on a regular basis I'm either showing or talking to students about or discussing with others. But some of them, frankly, were not ones that I habitually kind of look at or revisit. And so that was quite fun. And when you think about it, Mary Kay, you've put together just quite a canon, going back to Collection A, and now this is Collection B. It's just quite a canon of speeches, and the curation of them into the various categories in which you did was just has been excellent, I think. For me too, I think this is a portal into history.
Mm.
Looking at great historical speeches, a lot of times my students are very articulate about what they get out of the courses that focus on this content. And they just say it's a different portal in which to enter into and discuss history. And so, again, when I think about this overall, those 2 points to me really are salient.
That, I'm glad you said that because that motivated me quite a bit when we came up with the idea of doing this. That it's a great way to do two things. One is to teach history without saying, the American Civil War started in April, blah blah blah. It's a moment in time, and you can describe and tell that story. You can find a lot of these speeches online, but you can't find the backstory. And
Mm.
that's what really intrigued me is what made this person stand up and think they could change things. And many times they did change things. And so that's sort of the second half of this is the subliminal message is one person can make a huge difference in the life of this country. And so those were the two things that motivated me was to your point, both of you, the stories, the storytelling, not just the facts of the history, and then the personal aspect of what can I do to make a difference and speak
And
up.
that one person, oftentimes with the help of good speechwriters such as yourself.
And you, and communications coaches like Katie. You can have a really
Exactly.
well-written speech, but if you can't deliver it, it doesn't go anywhere.
Mm.
Um, okay, so let's get started with our audience interaction here. And we'll start with the first grouping that we did of Collection B. The first session was called Women in America. And I think we're going to put up the poll questions here for the audience to respond and tell us which one they liked best of these three. Susan B. Anthony's speech on women's right to vote, First Lady Barbara Bush at Wellesley College doing the commencement address, and Barbara Jordan's remarks at the Watergate hearings. Um, and I think you said something once to me, Rob, that you love a hostile audience. And not many people like to
Yes.
say that, but I would say all three of these had a hostile audience.
Yeah.
Any
Yes.
thoughts on that while people are voting?
Sure. With Barbara Bush, she wasn't the first choice from the graduating class of 1990 from Wellesley. It was actually Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple. And that graduating class so happened to have a color. Every graduating class apparently at Wellesley has a color. And that year it was purple,
Mm.
that graduating class. And so there was also this notion that Barbara Bush didn't exactly fit what Wellesley was trying to go for in terms of uh, what a woman should do with her life and her career. And so Barbara Bush knew that she was walking to that speech a little bit. And she just delivered a wonderful speech. If you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to do so. And she kind of in the moment turns that audience and has them eating out of her hand. And it's just to me, it's one of my favorite speeches, and I show this speech a lot to my students.
Uh, it's uh, there's a lot to be said. I'll hold off until we see how the audience votes. Uh, but I do think the Susan B. Anthony one too was interesting because she was on the speaker circuit
Mm.
and was basically practicing what she was going to say in court, and then she gets to court, and the judge, all male jury, male judge, male lawyers, she is not allowed to speak. She's then convicted without deliberation. And then the judge says, basically, young lady, do you have anything you'd like to say? And she says, oh yeah. And she she lets him have it. And I just thought it was amazing to read that whole backstory, which I had no idea, separate from the arguments she made. Um,
She sure was ready. She was ready to bring the case to the United States as a
yeah,
whole, really.
yeah. Um, Katie, any thoughts on Barbara Jordan and her delivery? Is a little unusual. She was not standing; she was seated.
Yeah, it was very interesting to watch because, of course, she is sitting at both elbows, leaning
Hmm.
forward into the microphone. To me, the combination of her physicality and the sound of her voice told me she was not happy to be there, but she was going to do it. She was going
Yeah,
to do her job. She was resolute. And she was calm.
yeah,
She was prepared, and her voice was so strong.
yeah.
She was really stepping into the problem as engaging deeply in trying to figure out what was going on.
My recollection of her, you can't see it in the video that we had that day because she was seated the whole time. But my recollection of her is that she was a pretty tall woman.
Hmm.
She was a very imposing figure. If she walked into the room, everybody knew it.
Hmm.
Is that your
He
recall?
was.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And she had a lot of charisma. And as you know, later she was stricken by MS. And so her political career was shortened because of that. But then she went on to teach at
Yeah.
the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT Austin.
Is that where you're an alum?
No, Texas State University.
Oh, Texas State. That's right. Sorry.
Our most famous alum is LBJ, and I'm not talking about LeBron James. I'm talking, talking about our presidents, and yes, and then our second is probably George Strait, but
Oh, very nice. Very nice.
But
Um,
Barbara Jordan is so clear and
mhm,
concise, and at the same time demonstrates her facility and knowledge of
mhm.
all of these great American documents. Um, I just think about her sitting down and being so careful about how she wanted to approach this moment and doing her
Right,
research. So
right.
smart.
Let's see if we have any
we have the
responses yet.
results.
Yeah, let's see if there's any. Here we go.
Oh,
Here we go.
Uh,
Oh my.
oh, Barbara Jordan takes the lead. Very
Yeah.
nice. And
hmm.
looks like a slight edge to Barbara Bush in second place and Susan B. Anthony bringing up the rear, but not by far. And
Mhm.
the thing that I will add about Barbara Bush is the fact that this speech was given um, with Raisa Gorbachev next to her at
Mhm.
the height of the crumbling of the Soviet Union and the fear of a crackdown in the Soviet Union, that there would be a bloodbath by the hardliners, and the fact that there wasn't, I don't completely attribute to the ladies, but I do think the fact that they were modeling, or Barbara Bush was modeling to the Russians, the Soviets, that this is how we handle dissent in the United States with charm and good humor and well-written, persuasive arguments to a hostile audience, I think makes that speech even more symbolically great, beyond just the great writing. I knew a lot of the people involved in it at the time. I was not, but I think it got elevated because of the moment in history and the way that they handled it.
And
Uh,
her anecdote embedded about the story of the mermaid, where the mermaids stand, is
yes,
just so great because it parallels so much of what she's facing with her audience. Where does she
right.
stand with the audience? And then of course she flips it on its head when she says something to the effect of, "And I wish him well," meaning that someday there's going to be a woman in the White House as our
Correct.
president, and that the first man will be there right there to support her.
Yes.
With Barbara Jordan, I mean, I didn't know if do we want to go ahead and talk more about
Why
some
don't
of
you
these
do real
features?
quick and then we'll move on to the next, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think the Barbara Jordan, one of the things my students love to hear this speech because of its structure. And it's somewhat unique in that she cites a founding principle, a first principle, and then she backs it up with evidence. And sometimes that's known as a deductive structure or the rule of example. And she's just so good about, she'll quote something from, say, Madison, Federalist
Mm-hmm.
65, the Virginia Ratification Convention, the North Carolina Ratification, all of these founding documents. And then she goes and imposes on top of that what Nixon has been doing related to
Mm-hmm.
Watergate. And she looks so nonpartisan. She looks like just an American, not a Democrat at the time. And of course, she's rhetorically careful about how she constructs all that. But at the end, I think my students say, well, how could you vote any otherwise? How could any
Yeah.
well-thinking American vote any otherwise, or to think any otherwise that impeachment proceedings should move forward? So
Mm.
just, she's so eloquent. The paper shredder metaphor she uses is incredible as
Yep.
well.
Yep. Well,
I
clearly the
was,
audience agreed with you. That was the winner with the viewers. Let's
yeah,
do our next. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was about to say, I even wrote down one of verbatim one of the sentences that she said that really stood out to me. Reason, not passion, which must guide our deliberations, guide our debate, guide our decision. And she exemplified that perfectly.
Yes. Yes. She walked the walk and talked the talk.
Hmm.
Uh, okay, let's go to our next grouping, which was on civil rights. And some of these are questions, I mean, it's single speeches, and some of them are pairs of speeches together. So here's your choices. Frederick Douglass, What to the Slave is the Fourth of July? What we're calling the road from Selma to Montgomery. Lyndon Johnson's We Shall Overcome, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s Our God is Marching On. Uh, Second set together is Martin Luther King's I've Been to the Mountaintop and Bobby Kennedy's speech in Indianapolis, Indiana, the next day. And then President Barack Obama's Yes, We Can on the night of the election. That's why he's president-elect there, election night 2008. So while the audience is voting, we have a question from one of our audience members. How do speakers today confront misinformation through storytelling? Any thoughts on that one? Let's start with Katie. Any thoughts there?
Wow, with storytelling, I think a great strategy is to bring things down to a personal, a very human level. And I often tell my students, start now, collect stories that exemplify big ideas, but keep
Mm-hmm.
it close to you. Keep it to things you know, people you know, events you've been involved in. And there is a difference, I think, when we hear people live speaking about their own stories. We can tell as humans when someone is being authentic.
Mm-hmm. Rob, agree, disagree? What do you think about
Yes, I
that?
just got back from a conference in Billings, Montana, and a lot of that focused on communication topics, and a number of the sessions focused on storytelling. So to the questioner, in terms of misinformation, I think if you're trying to right the ship on this misinformation, one of the things that I took away from the conference that I already kind of knew because I teach storytelling, but I wanted to make sure that what I'm doing kind of fits the frame of other people in that space, And that is, again, kind of Katie's point is to make it simple, keep it simple, but also stay to a simple structure. In other words, reflect on the past, think about what's going on in the present, and then also thinking about the future. And so I got that message from people who were storytellers in live context, but also digital and filmmaking storytelling seem to use that same pattern. So I'm not sure if I'm answering exactly what the questioner had, but I think getting back to Katie's point about authenticity, if you're trying to right the ship against immense information, that you stay true to that same simplicity and three-part structure, arc, if you will, then you should be okay.
So while we're waiting for our results, I'll tell you what's happened in my class is I was getting concerned about different students using different information sources. And as we know, speeches do not have footnotes in them. And so, which set of information do you go with? I was also concerned about students feeding the prompts into AI. AI is not known as being particularly accurate either. And so I said, look, if you use, you've got, I guess the way I said it was, if you think of this as Siri, Siri does not write good speeches because Siri does not make you laugh or cry. Siri does not tell good stories. Siri doesn't explain what the personal connection is to this topic. And so, if you want to do well in speech writing, have all those things storytelling, uh, what your connection is to this, people are going to be suspicious that you fed it into AI and that the information is not accurate. So the more you can make it about your own personal experience and what you've seen and why other people could be persuaded by that, the better the speech is going to be. And I think we've seen that in a lot of these. Oh, here's our results. It looks
Ah,
like our winner is Martin Luther King's Been to the Mountaintop and Kennedy's speech in Indianapolis. Close second, Frederick Douglass. What to the Slave is the 4th of July.
mm,
And then third is Barack Obama's Yes We Can, and a distant finish by Lyndon B. Johnson and Martin Luther King. I'm kind of surprised.
me
Uh,
too.
reactions there? Anybody surprised, not surprised by that?
Not surprised in that, the mountaintop speech is it may not be the most famous speech of MLK. I think we all know what,
Yeah, we
you
know which
know,
one. That was in the first selection.
AmericanRhetoric.com says,
Yes.
that there was a certain speech
And it was one
delivered
of the first ones we did in this
in
whole collection.
1963. It's
Right.
probably the best speech of all time. But it's kind of interesting to look at speakers as they progress through time. And I'd like to say some comments later about JFK in that same vein. But Martin Luther King, because of his theological training, uses a rhetorical device called dubitatio, which is basically rising intensity. And
Hmm.
he uses that so effectively, where you almost as a speaker feign or you really are nervous. And then suddenly there is this transformation that occurs in front of the audience. And MOK in that particular speech is just so on it. And of course, he almost is so prophetic about his own death. He says, I may not get there with you. And of course, the next day he is, killed by an assassin's bullet. It's just an incredible speech. Unfortunately, the speech is not well recorded, and so when you watch it, there are some breaks
Hmm.
in the actual footage, but it is just such an incredible speech in terms of the metaphors he uses. He uses this, I mentioned this call response of this rising intensity, which is called auxesis in I guess the Latin term, but and then the kind of litany, that chant like that he gets into talking about his experiences. He talks about being almost killed by a woman years before, and if it had just been an inch more, he would have died. And just vivid, creative language, and such. It's just a great speech. And I'll let you all talk about the RFK. That's another one, but I don't want to hog the airwaves.
What was your favorite, Katie?
Well, I have to say the Obama, Yes, We Can speech, in part because we get such a modern visual of the
Mm-hmm.
whole of the space and of the audience. In the very beginning, we have Obama standing there, and you can see the flags moving in the breeze behind him. And throughout, the camera continues to go to people in the audience. It's so
Mm-hmm.
impactful. Um,
Some of whom are
and
crying. Yeah.
yes, it
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
and in shock and
Yeah.
in awe. Um, and then Obama himself, as I'm listening to him and watching him, I get the physicality of his very open, eyes up, um, happy but still authoritative facial expressions that we see from Lyndon Johnson in his
Mm-hmm.
speech. And we get also the vocal cadence, the repetition, and the pauses that we hear in MLK's work.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that strength and openness physically and that very strong vocal work that draws us in, that call and response of yes, we can, that draws the audience in and asks them to participate. And in acting, we call that participation and the increasing level and energy of that as a build. And
Mm.
that stirs the audience's emotion and energy and gets everyone. It feels like we're all in this together, which is the point of his speech. And also, he also evokes JFK in the ask not what you can do for your country, or ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. He says the same thing. He says, we've all got to step in and work together and do the hard things together.
Yeah, I would just add that I think there's parallels between the end of the Obama speech, towards the end, where he has a 106-year-old woman that
Yes.
he calls out and talks about everything she has seen in her life in terms of progress of civil rights, and that she was still alive at the time, and how that became not him just reading a timeline of
Mhm.
progress, it
Yeah.
was tying it to one person's life. Uh, Again, going back to this idea of misinformation and storytelling, that gave it more credibility. And the same thing, Rob, you alluded to it. Martin Luther King in his speech tells the story of getting stabbed at a book signing within a quarter of an inch of his aorta, and the New York Times then reports that if he had sneezed before they removed the knife in surgery, he would have died. And so he gets a letter. He tells the story of getting a letter from a little girl who says, "Dear Dr. King, I'm so glad you didn't
It
sneeze."
just sneeze.
And then he does this litany. If I had sneezed, I would not have seen. And it's just like Obama's speech. He goes through the progress in the civil rights movement that he personally witnessed as a result of not sneezing. And
And it's
such a great setup of putting a story around what could be a very boring timeline, and made it come alive through human experience instead of just listing the facts.
Mhm.
So those are two things I
and
really like about that.
yeah,
And then before we get to our next group, which I think we should keep moving, uh, I am a big fan of that Bobby Kennedy speech. It is 5 minutes off the cuff, no notes. He had a prepared speech ready to go that would have been completely inappropriate campaign speech to give once the news broke about Martin Luther King's assassination. And it perfectly models Monroe's motivated sequence in terms of persuasive structure. And yet, this proves that that's how the human brain is wired to persuade. He did not sit down at a typewriter and think this all out and structure it. He quotes Aeschylus off the cuff, which is amazing. And then that was the one city in America that did not go into fires and riots that night, which I remember as a kid in Washington, D.C. I remember that all happening, and Indianapolis was spared, and I think a lot of people think it's because of that speech.
and
So,
I think a lot of these speakers took some instruction from Frederick Douglass, and I know that that was also
mhm.
popular with the audience in the polls. But if you think about the metaphors, the of highs and lows, distance and loss, He says,
Mm-hmm.
I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. Just so vivid. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. So great.
Wow. So good. So good. He was really amazing. And a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, by the way. Yeah. Okay, should we move to our next grouping? Uh, World War II and the Cold War. We have four choices here. Which one was your favorite? President Franklin Roosevelt's Day of Infamy address after the attack on Pearl Harbor? John Kennedy's inaugural address, Ask Not What Your Country Can Do for You? President Ronald Reagan's Boys of Point du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day? And President George H.W. Bush's speech at the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor? And while our guests are voting, we have a question from the audience. Are parables a good way to relate to an audience? And if so, what are your favorite parables in political speeches? I associate parables with the New Testament and Jesus using a lot of parables. I'm trying to think of politicians and leaders who have used parables. Do you any of you guys any jump to your minds?
Gosh, I don't know if this is a good fit, but the first thing that comes to my mind is Richard Nixon in the Checkers
Oh yeah, there
speech,
you go.
talking about his little dog.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Okay.
Checkers is that's a good parable. Yep, it stood for his arguments that he was not corrupt. He accepted a dog, not millions of dollars in bribes. Yes. Um, Rob, any thoughts on parables?
Well, the plowshares to swords. Again, I don't know if that's. I believe it is biblical. But if you think about the King Charles that came in April, he gave a great speech. I wasn't expecting much, but it really
Hmm.
was a good speech.
It
He
was a
kind
good
of
speech.
flips, yeah, he flips that. He talks about instead of swords into plowshares, which is a reference to George Washington becoming, going back to domestic civilian life. He turns it on its head and basically says, I hope we don't go from plowshares to swords in reference to the war in Iran, and
Mhm.
was very subtle, but yet paying tribute to a lot of our founding and first principles here. And if you haven't seen that speech, I definitely suggest that you watch that. I think again it put a new light, it cast a new light on King Charles for me.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Um, so some of our audience members are sending in suggestions, and one is Teddy Roosevelt's Man in the Arena. That's a good parable. Another is Reagan's Shining City on a Hill. Not bad.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
I would add to the Teddy Roosevelt list Man with the Muckrake. And that was a parable directly from Pilgrim's Progress of the man who's shoveling horse manure and won't look up and see all the beauty surrounding us. And so there's been a number of good ones like that. I do remember while we're waiting for our results, I remember my daughters were in I want to say sixth grade, and the teacher said this year's English lit class, the theme is going to be the epic journey, the heroic journey. And they were going to start with the Iliad and the Odyssey and end with Raisin in the Sun. And she said, Mary Kate, you're a speechwriter. Are there any speeches that illustrate the heroic journey? And so it's not quite a parable, but I said, yes, Reagan's Boys of Point du Hoc, because they climbed the cliffs and saved civilization. It wasn't just about getting to the top of the cliff, it was everything that that symbolized. And she said, great, can you teach that to the girls, please? And it was an all girls school. And I said, yes. And the best part is a woman wrote the speech. So,
Oh,
so it was great. Okay, here's our answers here. The winner is President John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. Ask not what you can do for the country. I mean, what the country can do for you. Uh, at 44%. Then almost a tie for second place. Franklin Roosevelt's Day of Infamy and President Reagan's Boys of Point du Hoc. And and then coming in the last place, but not even close, George H.W. Bush's speech at the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, but that's okay. Uh, okay,
Well,
reactions. What was your favorite, Katie, of those
well,
four?
Well, I have to say, it's been a long time since I've seen Reagan's speech at the boys of at Point to Hawk. And watching it again, I was so struck by how it was crafted, that it was set where it was looking out over that vast ocean. And the audience is so close to him, and they're not all sitting facing him, they're
Hmm.
wrapped around him. So that while he's speaking, we often see them as an
Right.
audience member. And he is standing behind that super narrow little podium, and he's keeping his body very still and not taking up a whole lot of space. Um,
Right.
that really shows me that his reverence, his willingness to not be the most important person in the room, so to speak. Um, and his voice echoes that. Reagan, of course, has a wonderful voice. Um,
Hmm.
it's very intimate, this space and the way he crafts it. Um, you can't help but be awed by the way he talks about how these young men starting out as boys and moving forward to becoming through this Herculean effort
Hmm.
of D-Day, becoming heroes. And to be in that landscape at the moment, he just puts all the pieces together for us.
Yep. Rob, what's your favorite of these?
Well, I like the one we just talked about a lot.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it's a great one. I'll just talk a little bit about FDR's speech. I think without, that speech models so much about what Lincoln set as a president, and that is brevity. It's just shy of 500 words. He uses that whole litany of last night, that repetition about 4 or 5 times. He uses a factual informational delivery in what would normally be a context or a speaking occasion where you would think it would be persuasion that
Mm.
would carry the day. But he uses a litany of very factual information about what the Japanese had attacked, not only Pearl Harbor, but other places in and around the Pacific, the Philippines, Malaya, Guam. And so you would think that would call for a persuasive type of delivery, but it's really using this notion of the factual account that literally takes us out of our own isolationism, which, FDR in his presidency was having to walk a tightrope, and things through like Lend-Lease and other initiatives, the Arsenal of Democracy, we were slowly becoming, or at least he was becoming, anti-isolationist. And so that speech is so incredible for that reason. Also, just certain lines like our righteous might, the assonance that he uses there, the vowel coupled with the consonant sounds, our people, our territory, our interests are in grave danger. Again, the use of assonance as a rhetorical device. It's a great speech. And of course, that speech on the wake of the attack of Pearl Harbor the day after plunges us into World War II. And if I don't know if anybody's watching the Tom Hanks World War II documentary
Mhm.
that's currently airing on the History Channel, but that war, like no other war, changed our culture, our history, our trajectory in ways that are hard to kind of pick at. And I think that's why there's so much programming about World War II, just because of the complexity and because of the downstream impacts. So
Um,
I think that speech is just incredible for those
yeah, it
reasons.
really is.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say a word about our winning speech on this one, uh, JFK's inaugural, and that was one of the inspirations for starting this whole series. Was I
Mhm.
was in my speech writing class, and this before I started teaching the greatest speeches, and I played a clip from Kennedy's inaugural, And the students, your average 18-year-old has heard the phrase, ask not what your country can do for you. But when I started playing the clips from the inaugural, they all started laughing. And I said, wait, what's so funny? This is not a particularly funny speech. I don't think there's any humor in it at all. And they all started laughing and they said, oh my gosh, Professor Cary, Park the car in Harvard Yard. We can't believe how thick that Boston accent is. And I was like, have you never heard John Kennedy's voice? And they said, nope, we've never heard it. And that made me really say, we got to fix this. And so I think that is one of the best inaugural, if not the best inaugural address ever written by the great Ted Sorensen. And this idea of we will bear any burden, pay any price, that whole litany, all in the defense of liberty, goes and goes to back to the Gettysburg Address, that we were conceived in liberty. And Kennedy puts an exclamation point on it and says, we will do anything to defend liberty in the world. The last thing I'll say before we go to our next one is the reason that George H.W. Bush's 50th anniversary at Pearl Harbor speech is in there with a score of 0 is because the students said to me, Professor, we got to have one speech that you wrote. So I said, all right, we'll do one. And that is the one we did. And the reason that it jumps out at me and the things that I love about it are I spent time with President Bush before I started writing, asking him about his experiences in World War II. And he got shot down. He lost 2 of his wingmen. He lost many, many friends in battle. And he was telling me story after story. I was taking notes like crazy. And I said, oh, this is going to be great in the speech. And he stopped and said, no, no, no. You can't put that in the speech. I won't get through the speech if we put that in there. No, none of that can go in. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to possibly use? So then we started crafting a different speech about forgiveness of the Japanese, bury the hatchet, honoring the dead who did not die in vain, and that we would do in the Cold War now what we did in World War II, which is lift up our enemies and help them towards democracy. It turns out it's the first time any president said that we had won the Cold War. And James Baker, I found out years later, took the speech with him within a week to Gorbachev and quoted those lines that we won and we're going to help our enemies. And that convinced Gorbachev to, amongst other things, he did a lot of stuff other than just quote my speech. But that helped in some small way to within 2 weeks, that was the end of the Soviet Empire and the flag went down over the Kremlin. So I didn't know that at the time. They didn't tell the speechwriters. And it wasn't until years later, a student of mine went to the Baker Library at Rice University and found this memo from Baker about what he said to Gorbachev. And so that's why I put it in there, is I think there's this amazing historical footnote to it. So
Well,
that's
yeah,
the
I
end of
think.
mine. Yep.
Well, and also I think that what you said about forgiveness is
Mhm.
what resonated with me, being the son of a World War II veteran who served in the South Pacific. Those that if he says if can forgive the Japanese, so can other Americans, and it's so true that if he can do that, so can we. And I always wondered, my dad after World War II, yeah, even when I was little, we started buying Japanese, products and motorcycles and that sort of thing. And I think his notion was again that, uh, hey, almost like the Marshall Plan, we have to build up Japan, not
Yeah.
not get them. So I think when he said George Bush, your boss, said we won, we have no enemies, we have made our enemies our friends. I have no rancor in my heart. Those must be your words, Mary Kate.
No, those came from him. That
Oh,
is
okay,
straight from him. I would never
okay,
have presumed to say whether he had rancor in his heart. He
right,
put that in there, and I knew it was gold and didn't touch it. Um,
yes, fascinating.
well, let's get our next set up, and while we're polling, I'll tell you a quick story. Which is your favorite speech about the American adventure into space? We'll try and keep this tight because we're getting a little tight on time. President John F. Kennedy's moonshot, President Richard Nixon's undelivered in the event of moon disaster, the eulogy for the astronauts in case they crashed on the moon and were killed. and President Ronald Reagan's address after the Challenger disaster. I'll tell you a quick story while people are voting. One of our viewers put into the Q&A, I love CAVU in all caps. And CAVU is a phrase that President Bush used all the time, and it is from pilots. And he was a Navy pilot. CAVU is Ceiling and Visibility Unlimited, CAVU, Ceiling and Visibility Unlimited. And it basically means sky's the limit, up, up, and away, everything's going to be great. And so he had that on signs at Kennebunkport. I've got a paperweight with it. He used it a lot. He would sign things that say CAVU, George Bush. And so I was on the team for when he passed away. There was going to be, by prior planning, a 6-hour window between when he passed away and when the American public would be informed, so that everybody, the family, the senior staff, everybody would know and could get to wherever they were supposed to be. I was on contract with CNN so that I could get to the CNN studios in time. I was in charge of the phone chain that was by text to tell a small group, and then they were supposed to tell 10 people, and they tell 10 people, and that's how we would get to everybody within 6 hours. And so we didn't want a text to go out that said, President Bush has just passed away. Because if a reporter saw it sitting on a table in a restaurant or something, then there goes the 6-hour window, right? So we said, what could be a good code for getting everybody to know that the president has just died? So we came up with CAVU, Ceiling and Visibility Unlimited. He's going to heaven, taking off for higher grounds. And so that was our secret code that he had gone to his great reward after a life of service. So I thought it was sweet that somebody just put in CAVU. Okay, so here's our winner for the best speech on the American adventure into space, Ronald Reagan after the Challenger, by a wide margin. Second place, Kennedy. Third place, Nixon's Undelivered. So what do we think about those? What were your favorites, you two? Which would you pick? Katie, why don't you tell us?
Um, I would pick the moonshot, JFK moonshot speech, partially because within myself, I have a little back and forth about um, what are the real benefits of space exploration. And watching this speech just reminded me of the power of this sort of adventure and the positive reasons that he sets out, that are very clear. And it's amazing that he is in a huge stadium with lots of people. And in this very inspirational speech, he manages to find a moment of pure, powerful humor when he talks about how hot it is in the stadium.
Hmm.
And it draws everybody in, and it makes it feel like we are together in this
Yep.
adventure. And it also talks, kind of alludes to what he's talking about, that we want to do the hard things, that there's good reason to do the hard things. So there's good reason to be sitting there and talking in this heat about this adventure that we need to embark on.
Yeah, I agree with that. Rob, what do you think? What was your favorite?
Well, just to pick up on the moon speech again, if you think about JFK, if you start with his Houston Ministerial Association speech when he's a candidate in 1960, September of 1960, and then you jump forward to this speech, and then you think about the Berlin speech that he gave in June of 1963, you really see JFK maturing as a speaker. And one of the things that you see in that maturation is his ability to go off script a little bit. And in this speech, he does that a few times. I love some of the lines, if I can. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested, wished to look behind them. Uh, they were conquered by those who move forward in solo space. And then he goes on to talk about how hot it was that day. And of course, he says some great lines. But why, some say, the moon? So he's trying to justify, why are we putting so much money into moon exploration? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the mountain? Why 35 years ago fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? And that rhetorical device is called hypophora, posing questions and then answering them. And of course, as Katie said, it was a very hot day. It was September, and it was 85 degrees and 85% humidity that day. So it really was a scorcher. And you can see non-verbally behind Kennedy, you can see LBJ wiping his brow and his forehead,
Yep.
and everybody looks so uncomfortable. But again, this improvisational skill that he was so gifted at, and he became so gifted at, shows up again. I'm the one who's doing all the work, he says at some point. This is where he gets off script. So we just want to stay cool for a minute. And again, he just is able to do that. And he does in his I Am a Berliner speech in 1963. The audience hasn't seen that speech. He's again see that maturation of
Great one to
him,
watch.
yeah,
Great
becoming
speech. Yeah.
improvisational. So it's a great one. The Reagan speech, I mean, again, we know that he didn't have long to take what was going to be that evening, the State of the Union address, tweak that, and deliver what quite possibly is the best 4 minutes of TV by any political actor in modern
Mhm.
times.
Since we're getting closer on time, I'm going to put up the next poll question, and while we're waiting, I'll give you my answer on the space one. How about that?
Okay.
Right.
Okay, here's our final question. Which speech best exemplifies the ideals of the Gettysburg Address? Susan B. Anthony arguing for women's right to vote, Martin Luther King's I've Been to the Mountaintop, giving the history of the civil rights movement, uh, President Barack Obama's Yes, We Can, uniting the country towards more civil rights progress, President Reagan's Boys of Point du Hoc, summarizing the victory in World War II, and President John Kennedy's moonshot, tying space exploration to our founding values. Okay, so while our audience is voting on that, I would just say on the previous question on American adventure into space, so Bill Safire was a mentor of mine as a speechwriter, and he's the one who wrote the Nixon eulogy just in case this happened. And one of our audience members just wrote in about how he had seen some of the files on how risky that moon landing was, and everybody was painfully aware that this could easily have happened, that it would have ended in tragedy. And I think Sapphire was more surprised than anybody when his draft that never got used turned up in the National Archives and was being displayed next to the Declaration of Independence, amongst other things. And I remember thinking at the time, when I learned about that he had written this, and then seeing Peggy Noonan having to write the Challenger speech in what, 6 hours instead of the State of the Union getting, shelved. Uh, why was that not standard operating procedure that there would always be a eulogy ready to go? And you would think after Sapphire's thing that that would have been normal. And I'm not sure that it ever became standard operating procedure. I didn't hear of a eulogy ready to go in case Artemis crashed. So it's kind of amazing that that didn't change things and cause speechwriters to say we should have something ready to go. So that's my only observation on that. I thought they were both great. Here we go. Here's our poll answers. Our winner. Ooh, we have a
Ooh.
tie. Tie for first place. That's the
Mm.
first time we've ever had that.
Yeah.
President Barack
Wow.
Obama's Yes, We Can, and President Reagan's Boys of Point du Hoc. In a it's statistical, not even an actual tie. Then we have next is I've Been to the Mountaintop, and then Susan B. Anthony, and then Moonshot's the last. So who would like to make the case for the tie? Which of those two did you like best, if you have an opinion? Katie?
Mm. Well, boy, it's like comparing apples to oranges for me. They're both fruit, but there's so many differences. Um, the
Well,
Reagan
frame it in
speech.
terms of the ideals of the Gettysburg Address. That's the question. Which one
Okay.
fulfills the Gettysburg Address more?
I have to go with Yes, We Can. Obama just weaves in so much of the ideas that are inherent in the Gettysburg Address, the communal effort to work towards the promise of liberty and freedom. It seems to be very threaded through Obama's
Okay.
speech.
Okay, Rob, we're running. You got
Well,
1 minute.
yeah, on
There you go.
The Gettysburg Address talks about hollowed ground, obviously, as kind of a master metaphor in a way. So I'll go with Boys a Point of Hope because if you think about the notion of place and that they're both kind of on hallowed ground, and then picking up on the work of Lincoln, that there's so many parallels, right? That this is kind of a post-battle speech
Right.
that we're talking about with the Gettysburg Address, but we're also talking about a post-battle speech, albeit 40 years later, with the Boys of Pontahook with Ronald Reagan. So, for those reasons, I'll go with that one.
Mm.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, that it's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War and the basically the biggest battle of World War II, and a lot of the same Greek eulogy type of messages. We honor the dead by doing the
Praise,
a lot of
lament,
work
and
for freedom.
consolation.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I will say in closing that the team at Night for Night, which was our amazing production team for this, surprised me by putting at the end of the Gettysburg Address episode in our grand finale a composite sort of montage of all the speeches that they thought reflected the Gettysburg Address. And they did a spectacular job and didn't tell me. And as I was watching it, I started crying because I hadn't seen it before. And it was everything from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, the Teddy Roosevelt stuff, uh, Douglas MacArthur, the Patrick Henry, uh, Ronald Reagan's Time for Choosing, all of this being tied to the Gettysburg Address, Jefferson's inaugural, Barbara Jordan, George W. after the 9/11 attacks, Obama saying, "This is our moment. Yes, we can." All of this ties to the Gettysburg Address call to action of can this government by and for the people survive in the future? And the answer was yes. I also want to say thanks to in that final episode, Stephen Light was our actor of doing a great job as Abraham Lincoln. We had A.D. Carson doing Frederick Douglass, Jody Kilbasa as Nixon, all the undelivered ones, all the ones that we didn't have video for. Fiona Turnbull did Susan B. Anthony. Like I said, Night for Night did out of the ballpark job on all of the production, the copyright, the images, and the student researchers, and led by Sarah Hart, who pulled together so many stories. I learned so much, and I just think my final thank you is to the UVA Office of Engagement for having the ability to distribute this to so many people and to get the word out. It's been the joy of my life to be able to do this project, and I cannot say thank you enough to everyone, especially to you, Katie and Rob, for joining me to look back on it all and celebrate it. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
And
Thank
a
you.
big thank you to Mary Kate Cary. Fantastic job.
My
And
pleasure.
panel,
My
what a
pleasure.
great conversation today. But really, hats off to you, Mary Kate, because you
Thank
pulled it
you.
all
It's been a
together and
joy.
made it happen. So
Love it.
thank you all. This was such an engaging conversation, and you shared your expertise with us on these pivotal historic speeches. This was fascinating. Thank you so much for a great afternoon, Mary Kate, Michael, and Katie. Mary Kate, it was a pleasure working with you here at UVA. You will be missed. Audience, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and your interest in this program. We invite you to continue watching the Speaking of America episodes. Share this great program with friends and family. Also, check out our Thoughts from the Lawn blog for articles written by UVA faculty. Visit us at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Enjoy your summer, and we look forward to seeing you this fall for more great lifetime learning programs. Be well.